And welcome everyone, and seeing some familiar faces here. Kevin, you want to come up here and do this? No? You're good? Okay. Actually, let me start with something somewhat unusual, possibly. Usually you're told to put away your phones. Can you all take them out, please? And search for climate change in Google Images. And if and when you do that, you get some overview of whatever Google thinks climate change looks like these days. There's a bunch of the AI generated stuff up there. There's also your own bubble, turns out, as there is with everything. And turns out that bubble changes by country, by location. Right? On average, certain locations, certain countries are more likely to get dispassionate, lovely climate scientist here on the right, and some graphs with stuff pointing up, and maybe renewables get cheaper and so on. Some others get different images, actually more AI generated, if you will, on the left. Right, sort of more happy-go-lucky. And yes, turns out this is research here at CBS, not by me, by a grad student here, a postdoc, sorry, Mike, a postdoc here in the management division. And it turns out that the images you see influence how strong your belief is in, let's say, support for certain climate policies. And yes, on average, and the US turns out to be sort of kind of average here in the middle, certain countries are going to get very sort of concerning images, and then their citizens are more concerned about climate change. Okay, so for any statisticians in the room, correlation is not causation, of course. Right? Chicken and egg for the rest of us. Maybe those more concerned are more likely to want to look at certain images, and those are the images you then see. Yes, but, okay, yes, there's a paper where this came from, and yes, you then can back out the implications that say, wait, based on your filter bubble, based on the things you do see, you are more likely to support certain policies. And, okay, business school being the business school, management division being the management division, you can now take this in one of two directions. Right? We're not CEPR. We're not the School of Public Policy. We are not the place that, and therefore let's design policy in a certain way. It may be along the lines of, okay, let's, quote unquote, take advantage of that. Let's figure out how to influence the images seen by, let's say, our customers. And there's a lot more here. I'm not going to do this research justice here, other than to say that, yes, look it up, and there is a lot going on, not just in this paper, but at CBS in general, that takes a step back and says, at the end of the day, the sort of things we are bombarded with on a daily basis. And to be clear, reason, by the way, sorry, my slides were late. I couldn't submit them 48 hours in advance for today, because this is from Wednesday. Switzerland, Blatten, Switzerland. That's a real image, not AI generated. And yes, the Swiss do trust science. I'm not going to say believe science, trust science. So yes, even the sheep and the cows were medevaced out of there, or flown out of there with helicopters 5 days before. That village was evacuated, nobody died. But that's the valley. Flin Flon, Manitoba. I also did not know where Flin Flon, Manitoba was before this morning, but this is an image from yesterday. Right, we've been through this before, here in New York, by the way, August, a couple of years ago. Yes, that too is happening as we speak. Canadian tundra, once again, burning, and dramatically so. Now, the immediate response from anyone here should be, okay, so what, right? Weather's been changing, there are accidents, but let me just put it about as bluntly as we can, and happy to take this outside after, but let's not debate the science. What we can do, what we should do, is debate what's called the attribution of those sorts of implications, images, to climate change. Again, this is from today. Now, this too should give you pause, right? This is the difference in degrees centigrade, yes, real science, not Fahrenheit, sorry, centigrade, to normal. And yeah, look at northern Canada. Look at Siberia, for that matter. New York happens to be pretty cool today, relatively speaking. Not all the time, everywhere, of course, but this is a view of differences from normal life today. And here's the attribution. Climate shift index. How much of that difference can statistically be attributed back to excess CO2 in the atmosphere? And again, right, certain regions are actually colder today than they should have been. It goes the other way. But, well, look at the globe on average. And yes, right, this is highlighting Canada here. This is the tropics. And by the way, we can do this now 3 days in advance. This is Tuesday. 18 months ago, 2 years ago, it basically took us, science, something like 5 years, 6 years, or however many years, to attribute a past climate event to climate change. A massive storm, go away, write the paper, and then some white paper comes out, eventually being published that says, oh, that hurricane 2 years ago, 5 years ago, was X% more likely because of climate change. We can do this now basically like weather forecasts. And yes, we are already running out of colors in this index. When this was introduced a couple years ago, 5 was up in the extreme, 5 times more likely due to climate change. Look at the number of regions that are 5 today. Actually, 3 days from today, Tuesday. Or back to Canada. Yes, of course, this is climate change. And this sort of calculation, which, yes, the theory has been with us forever, a couple decades. This IPCC from a decade or so ago. Right? What's the probability of a certain degree centigrade temperature reading on a certain day? Well, and if you take this 1-2 literally, just to be clear, the chance of these extreme events just went up infinitely much. Right? If you cut off the tail before and say, no, there's no chance, which of course is never the case, but yes, you have massive increases in probability of these extremes due to relatively small global average increases in temperatures. And no, those increases aren't small either, of course. Okay, yes, climate risk is financial risk. There's a paper where that came from. And many, many, many more. Yes, it's policy risk. Right? None of this is just the risk of you personally being hit with by whatever it might be, wildfire, flood, and so on. Most businesses, most of the time, are affected or influenced by transmission through policy. Also reputation, of course. And yes, the attribution really hits home when it comes to legal risk. And to see that, let's listen to Shell for a couple of minutes. Let me try this.
The future. We're all headed there. The big question is, what will be waiting for us? For over 40 years, Shell has invited experts all over the world to consider our possible futures. The latest possible scenarios probe as far ahead as 2100 and offer two alternatives, labelled mountains and oceans. The ocean scenario describes a future where, driven by market forces, the global energy landscape sees a surge in demand that brings strong social and political tensions. Emerging markets bloom. But profit-driven motives means that externalities such as CO2 emissions are neglected. Fossil fuels are important to the energy mix, but nonetheless renewables grow, and by 2070, solar is the largest energy source. The mountain scenario describes a future where, anticipating the switch away from oil and coal, global policy shifts to support compact cities and an overhaul of the transport network. By 2030, carbon capture and storage receives major investment, and gas is the primary energy source. Such developments enable electricity to be carbon neutral as early as 2060. And yet, by interfering with the free market, global social mobility is thwarted. Of course, these scenarios may ultimately prove inaccurate, but simply by stimulating dialogue today on developments which might be critical tomorrow, they could just prove to be invaluable.
Lovely little co-promotion here. Wired and Shell. Up. We don't need the next videos. There we go. Okay, cool. Actually, this is the moment where I would ask for what stuck out to you, dear class, from watching these 2 minutes. Actually, I won't cold call Kevin, but as you are eating your chip. But okay, these are a couple of bits that stuck out to me. But anything else? The world is very safe. Let me paraphrase. None of this is if, it's when, right? So, this is Shell in 2012, decade ago by now, basically saying that under one scenario of us not doing much of anything whatsoever, the largest electricity source on the planet within 50 years, 60 years technically in this case, will be solar PV. And no, we are an oil and gas company. We don't do that at the moment. Yeah, they were beyond petroleum at the time, but they were oil and gas. And the most ambitious scenario was, okay, yeah, much faster, electricity carbon neutral as early as 2060. I saw one more hand here. It is certainly about technology. I'm not sure I would say linear, right? Like all their curves are basically these massive, but so yes, fair enough. There is no massive, right? Our business will withstand those forces, which to be clear is why Shell scenario planning exists and has existed by now for 50 plus years, right? And yeah, Shell is pretty darn good at this. Now, one other sentence stuck out to me at least, and yet by interfering in the free market. Right? Okay, newsflash, dear Shell, the energy market is not a free enterprise market to begin with. And yeah, not pricing the externality is anything but a level playing field. So, congrats to your last, I don't know, Shell's quarterly profits last quarter, but, Saudi Aramco's $25 billion last quarter. Sure, it's 8 billion of us paying for that. Right? Externality, the one shtick we have as climate economists. Now, let me just say one more thing about the not disruptive. This is from 1998. Following the storms, which, by the way, yes, right, we've had those since then, turns out. A coalition of environmental NGOs brings a class action suit against the US government and fossil fuel companies on the grounds of neglecting what scientists, including their own, have been saying for years, that something must be done. A social reaction to the use of fossil fuels grows and individuals become vigilante environmentalists. In the same way, a generation earlier, they had become fiercely anti-tobacco. Direct action campaigns against companies escalate. Young consumers especially demand action. 1998. Greta was born 5 years later. Now, that's not how scenario planning works, but yes, loosely interpreted, this is Shell predicting Greta before Greta was born. By 2020, a youth-led uprising that made oil and gas up to a point in certain areas, in certain aspects, go the way of tobacco in the minds of some and certainly not others. Yeah, been there. Was it enough to solve climate change? Nope. But just to give you a sense, right, this is the same interviewer, the same graphic artist for that matter, New York Times Magazine. Greta on the left, Bill Gates' favorite energy policy analyst on the right, Václav Smil. In the most stereotypical juxtaposition imaginable. Right? The 20-year-old on the left, the 80-year-old on the right. The 20-year-old says, I'm trying to do my best to change things. And the 80-year-old says, I'm not talking about what could be done. I'm interpreting the world as it is. And the one thing to take away from this is, yeah, they are saying the same thing. They are literally saying the same thing. They're basing it on the same facts. They're drawing different conclusions. And not to force us to refresh our high school, maybe college philosophy class, normative versus positive. Positive being, let's interpret the facts. Normative, let's add our judgment on top. That's the difference. That's the only difference. Right? You have the visionary, the dreamer, and yes, you have someone who says, I'm not talking about what could be done. And the Pendulum, title for today, right, the policy, is all about that. That's it. And yes, back to little here is if, it's when. And yes, of course, the when makes all the difference. Right, so actually, as somebody who's technically still on leave from BCG, actually. So I spent 10 months there in 2007-8, just not long enough not to have to pay back the sign-on bonus. So I never did. I'm still on leave, I believe. This is fiction, of course. Right, at some point, it just becomes comical to basically keep saying, oh yeah, in order to get to a particular top-down climate goal, here is what needs to happen. It looked less fictitious, let's say in 2005, when we negotiated the Paris Agreement, when 1.5 was for the very first time mentioned, enshrined, if you will, in one of these international agreements. showing this in Davos in 2024. That was last year's BCG entry to the World Economic Forum, or slide 1 of the 3-slide presentation. Yeah, I'm not so sure. And not just I'm not so sure, but yeah, sorry, that won't happen. Now, of course, me standing here saying that basically means, okay, wait a second, you don't actually think we can? That defeatism comes immediately after this statement. I would say, back to the when, not if, and the when is what matters. The realism built into saying, sorry, minus 7% in annual emissions between now and forever won't happen, certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't try, A, and B, everything else we know is speeding up, and dramatically so. Okay, so yes, back to the pendulum. I could now basically spend the next, however long we have, 20 minutes-ish, plus discussion, standing in front of this graph. This is Texas, this is California. Utility scale solar PV deployment. Okay, so I'm happy to say, thanks to a fellow Austro-American you may have heard of, California came first. Schwarzenegger signed the laws into place 2010, 2011. It used to be called, or it was called at the time, the Million Solar Roofs Initiative. Turns out they renamed it pretty quickly, largely because they got to 1 million solar roofs pretty darn fast. It was soon called the California Solar Initiative, CSI. Yes, he hails from Hollywood. And the early subsidies, feed-in tariffs and so on, yes, there's an emissions trading system, there's a price on the bad stuff, and there are subsidies for the good stuff, led to basically us forcing more solar PV onto the California system than would have happened in a free market scenario, if you will. Okay, so I won't psychoanalyze Californians now to try to interpret why that has been a linear line, more or less, from the beginning. Right, subsidies high at first, came down almost immediately by design in part. But yeah, NIMBYism, lots of other things that have basically led to a flattening, if you will, of that curve. And look at Texas. There's no state levels policy here. Let's just get that out of the way. There is no Austro-American anyone trying to sign any laws into place at the state level. Texas, of course, is the beneficiary of the same federal policy. Now, when did the federal policy come in? Well, Biden Inflation Reduction Act 2022. No, that was not the reason Texas solar PV took off. By the way, this is a little bit dangerous now, but can you take your phones out again? I actually can't get to it on this computer here. Let's look at the Texas grid live right now. Yep, wasn't dangerous after all. 40% solar PV right now. Texas. Texas. Yeah, 40% is natural gas. So the wind doesn't blow today, turns out. 7% is coal right now, and yep, that's bad. And by the way, so is gas. 10% is nuclear, which if I were to say that out loud in my native language, I would have to hand back one of my 2 citizenships. So I will not say anything positive about nuclear. But yes, of course, that's good from a climate perspective. And yeah, there are some, very political reasons why certain countries don't like certain technologies, let's say. But yeah, Texas, without state-level support, where, by the way, solar PV, yeah, was, where? 2014, 2013, it was literally zero. And it might as well have been zero in, 5 years ago. And yes, when Texans wake up, right about now, or when they woke up 6 hours ago, but when they wake up on a day like today, and the sun doesn't shine yet, it's batteries that come into the tune of like 5, 8%. Those were 0 2 years ago. Utility scale lithium-ion batteries. This now is the exact opposite of me showing you the 1.5 degree graph and saying that we can't get there, the 1.5 degrees, sort of climate denial, if you will. Because in this case, right, what one could accuse the policy guy at the business school of is to give up on policy. Texas doesn't need it, apparently. Now, turns out there are some underlying forces here that are, yes, basically unstoppable. There is no way that we will unlearn how to install solar panels. Right? The first panel, don't know which side is up, the million solar roofs initiative. Yeah, you sort of get the hang of it. And yeah, these panels have been getting cheaper and cheaper forever. When Jimmy Carter put them on the White House, and Reagan took them down 5 years later, they were literally 100 times more expensive than today. 12 years ago, 10 times more than today. But nobody takes solar panels off anybody's roof these days. Doesn't matter where. Why? It's the cheapest source of electricity in history. And yes, the pink, purple, red line, that's solar plus storage. 4 hours of lithium-ion batteries. 4 hours for those doing the calculation. Nope, that doesn't cover the full night, turns out. You might need 8 hours or 12 hours. But yeah, for grid stability, 4 hours is sort of what most of us calculate when we look at grid integration of intermittent renewables, where yes, newsflash, wind doesn't always shine. Yeah, not shine either. Blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And yeah, so this is not a 200-year-long series. Coal, inflation adjusted, has literally been constant, plus minus a bit, for 200 years. Price of electricity generated from coal, constant for 200 years. Solar, wind, by the way, was cheaper sooner. This is the cover of The Economist a year ago. And yes, this is sophomoric humor from our British friends, but sun, sand, and human imagination, and all three are limitless. They're right. Okay, again, Economist from a year ago. Remember Shell, 2070, without even trying? The majority of electricity, solar PV. This is 2060, without even trying, with some trying by now, but not really. Current policies. Solar, yes, the majority. The rest is wind. P2X, still solar. Photovoltaic to electrolyzers to hydrogen. Zero carbon liquid fuel. And, well, there is nuclear. There are other renewables, yes, hydro and so on. Biofuels, a little bit. Oil, coal, and gas, gone by 2060. Not because of massive policy push, not because of, 1.5 degrees, let's work backwards. simply because this is The Economist revisiting November last year. You've got to feel for these people. These are the energy analysts, the gray lines, right? Year after year after year, the prediction of where solar PV is going to go, and then reality. At some point, it becomes comical. And then, yes, finally, right, in 24, IEA decides, okay, let's have this be slightly higher here. And they were more wrong than ever before in 24. Why? Because solar PV shot up. And it's that. It's those forces where I know page 27 of the teaching handbook says I'm not allowed to mention politics in the classroom, so let me not. But, okay, if you want to stand in the way, right, this is yet another wall that's not going to get built. There is no way to try to push against this to such an extent that, okay, yeah, there are problems here. Okay, this is me playing up my accent a bit and writing some advice to our German friends. And part of this is go look at Texas. Germany's been in a recession for 2 years. Why? Lots of reasons. Putin blowing a fuse. Yes, February 24th, 22. That helps or hurts, of course. Lots of other factors. But the main one, the underlying one, is high energy prices. Chris Wright, our energy secretary, spent almost half of his very, very first speech as energy secretary obsessing over Germany. And newsflash, he got a few things wrong. What he got right was, yeah, Germans today are paying 3 times more for their electricity than they did 15 years ago, after $500 billion worth of investments in the energy transition. And, yep, it takes more than simply saying, okay, let's subsidize the good stuff. It might, for anyone who deeply cares about electricity markets, the link on the bottom, and the 2-tiered electricity pricing system. Right, yeah, let's keep market forces operating, but let's separate low-carbon renewables from fossil fuels in order to keep the incentives while also making sure that the savings are being passed down. Okay. Yep, not if, but when. And leaving 10 minutes for discussion, let me just say one very quick, very local version of the policy pendulum story. Who is from New York here? So we got trash bins. Mandatory on January 2nd, as of January 2nd this year. Right? January 5th, congestion pricing. Now, turns out, okay, the trash bins, yep, they were, I guess, a few decades in the making, and yes, help make the city a better place to live as well. Econ 101 works. By the way, a Columbia economist who came up with the idea in principle 60 or so years ago. $9 per ride into Lower Manhattan? Nope, it's not the full externality. Right? Not every car all the time, but also not, right, a car over its lifetime. This is once. Driving into Lower Manhattan once. No pollution externality, none of the other stuff, just congestion externality of one Jerseyite driving into Lower Manhattan. Sorry, any Jerseyites? Sorry about that. Sorry. Thanks for coming to, you know. $150 during rush hour, of course, right? Not when the streets are empty. Right, so the $9, right, barely scratches the surface. And just to be clear, yeah, Econ 101, the one shtick we have, price up, demand down, works every single time. And this is the New York Times going through a whole bunch of metrics they could think of over the last 4 months by now, 5 months almost. Yeah, there are some where we can't tell yet. By the way, the list is cut up. There's a few more where we can't tell. None of these are red. every one of these points in the right direction. Traffic, by the way, 40% of New York City emissions, building 60%. Yeah, and there too. We actually passed the right laws. The question is whether we implement, of course. And the real question is, what do we do that moves us beyond, right? So this is the city, pendulum swinging back. What does that mean for the state level? What does it mean for, eventually, the federal level, even in this country? And yeah, it is precisely the climate tech on the one hand. That's the optimistic end. Yep, it's the localities, the cities, the states. Or, by the way, Germany tried to pass the sort of law that New York State has. The German coalition government with the Greens in government fell apart over their heating law. New York banned gas connections to new buildings as of a year ago, by the way. Right? No more new gas in new buildings. They know it's bad. They know there are better ways to boil the water and, for that matter, heat the home, both because of the physics and also because of economics. And then the big, big question mark, of course, is the last bit. Right? Or essentially, yeah, what we see, to say it out loud, is some companies who may no longer talk about it publicly, who are no longer, this is from 22, putting out basically versions of IPCC graphs under the BlackRock logo. But that if you take the statement that yes, it's still on their website, seriously, basically says none of this is if, it's when. And yes, right, none of this is their money, by the way, right? They're the world's largest fiduciary. It's our money. So they're not setting a target. They are predicting. They are basically telling us how the world is going to be. We anticipate, that word does a lot of work here, that by 2030, 75% of our holdings are net zero oriented. And now we can debate what the net means in net zero. Today, 3 years or so ago, 25% of their holdings net zero oriented. So in other words, if this is where they think the world is going, no matter what happens politically right now, no matter where the short-term pendulum swings, then yes, their anticipation suddenly turned into a target. Right? If you reshuffle $11 trillion worth of assets for a world where 3 times more of your holdings will be net zero oriented, and that's both reshuffling and those holdings are transitioning, transforming themselves, suddenly you want the world to look this way too. Suddenly that forecast has become the target. Suddenly Václav Smil has become the Greta Thunberg saying, yep, I want the world to go this way because we'll actually save some money or make some money in the process as well. Thank you. So your next engagement is 7 p.m. dinner, right? So we have 4 hours now for Q&A. Let's give it 10 minutes, but yes. Questions, concerns before the cold calling starts? So, no, do we actually have? You're next. Microphone is coming to you in a second.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and good to see you again. I have one question regarding the graphic you showed between California and Texas. And I believe the argument you are making is that California put a lot of money, time, effort, and so on into the policies, now ending up below sort of where Texas is. At the same time, if you look at the area under the curve, you could argue that it made sense to make those investments to prevent sort of the more fossil fuel sources of energy from being used until now to that extent, right? So obviously, like they might be a bit below Texas now, but they got much higher up earlier on, and all along they've been preventing sort of CO2 emissions by doing so. So I was just curious how you view that versus just the line.
Okay, so I'm fully with you. Yes, right. California is still the good guys here because the when matters. And yes, right, integral under the curve. Yes, there has been more solar for longer. This inflection point, the cross, only happened October last year. But my bigger point is, so first of all, the trajectory matters a lot, right? Unless something happens in California, right? You come back to this is your first reunion, right? To your 11th reunion, a decade from now. And well, the integral might look different already, right? And then, frankly, and this is, again, this is not a policy pendulum, just to be clear, right? So, okay, some underlying figures here. This year, the US is installing 50 gigawatts worth of solar PV. That was 7-ish, 5 or so years ago. By the way, capacity to produce solar PV in this country right now, also around 50 gigawatts. That's the panel assembly, right? That's not the full supply chain. And yes, whatever might happen with the Inflation Reduction Act and HR 1, which just passed the House, and nope, it's not a good idea to pass that as is in the Senate. But if we keep some of those incentives in place and that manufacturing capacity remains and the broader trends continue, it is all about the second and third derivative, to use the technical term, and yes, it's all about the trajectory. Right? So again, I'm with you, yes. The Europeans, the Germans, the Californians for that matter, who came early and yes, did the right thing, policy-wise, technology-wise, and so on. In fact, we owe them some debt. Actually, what I would usually say in this context, if I were to talk about German subsidies, or for that matter, cheap Chinese panels, is the only appropriate response is for the rest of us to brush up on our German and Chinese and start writing thank you notes. Yeah, they might have over-subsidized, but it's because of those investments from the Germans on the demand side, and yes, California too, and the Chinese especially on the supply side, that the rest of us now benefit from those cheap panels. And yep, it's about the trajectory. Kevin. Does a microphone come?
So can you go back to the ski slope slide with how we have to cut emissions so quickly?
The BCG one?
No, the one where you show emissions going up, and to get 1.5, we have to ski slope.
Oh, yes, yeah, that is from our friends at BCG. So I'm not blaming BCG, by the way.
No,
McKinsey, I'm sure.
No, my point is, aggregate data in that case doesn't tell the whole story that I'm sure you're aware of, which is I'm asking you why you didn't discuss it. So
nature-based?
No.
Okay.
If you look at what's going on in emissions, emissions are coming down in Europe. They're coming down in the U.S. They're coming down in Japan. Yes. They're coming down everywhere. They're coming down in
China as of literally
the
last 12 months.
But the outlier has been China and India, which emissions have gone up like a rocket ship.
Okay.
So that chart is distorted. Yes. And I'm wondering why you're not covering those stories.
Because you didn't give me until 7 p.m. today to go through the 180 slide. Okay, fair enough. And by the way, when I said China, so this is literally, so this week's Economist, literally, this week's Economist, one of the main upfront articles, Chinese emissions down 1%. In the last 12 months, not last year, but the past 12 months until March, April or so, compared to the prior 12 months. By the way, The 5-year plan currently in place says Chinese emissions shall peak by 2030. Okay, so yes, COVID, yes, lower than expected GDP growth, and neither of that is good. But the rapid deployment of renewables, of course, contributes to that. And yes, China is still building coal plants. And yes, there are other forces at work. But China meeting its 5-year report target 5 years early, that's a big deal. Yes. To quote the prior president, BFD, I believe is the technical term. And it's precisely that, right? So, okay, so optimistic hat on, right? Yep, still a lot that needs to get done, of course. But yeah, the 7% looks ambitious, very ambitious as we speak. Is it completely out of the question? No, because all the underlying forces point closer in that direction than in the direction of, oh yeah, we're gonna unlearn how to, install the solar panel.
Hi, so I work in technology, and one of the
good
risks,
kind or the bad?
it's
The high-tech
SaaS
kind,
software, right?
The neutral kind.
Vertical
okay.
SaaS, small software company.
The energy hawk kind. Okay.
And that's actually related to my question, which is kind of, there's obviously the big risk to the positive side of the story is that a lot of the capacity that we're developing that's renewable essentially gets soaked up by what seems to be like a somewhat linear relationship between intelligence and power consumption. And we seem to have an almost limitless appetite for intelligence. And if it continues to grow at the rate it is, it's going to soak up a lot of that capacity, and you're not going to see the reductions in the in the CO2 emissions from coal and gas, et cetera. So what should we be thinking about, those of us that can make decisions about how we deploy various technologies in trying to play a part in not making the problem worse, even as we're getting ahead in other areas?
Great question. 2 quick answers. So one, right, this is the very optimistic Texas, hey, look, trajectory. How much fossil fuel infrastructure for power production has been phased out in Texas as a result of this? None, more or less, plus minus. Why? Well, these are additions, right? You're planning how to meet demand. You go to the sources that make the most sense, that are the most profitable. Yep, that's solar plus batteries these days. And yes, there's some wind involved too. Turns out there's plenty of investment in other areas too. Right? We're reviving 3 Mile Island. We're doing lots of other things that are on the zero carbon front now. We are also building gas plants, of course. Right? Okay, so what can the tech sector do? Okay, anyone from Google here? Anyone used Google at some point? Google still has this goal, and I say still because, right, so you might expect them, okay, sorry, can't, AI, Trump, whatever else, right? Their goal, 24/7 carbon-free electricity by 2030. Some of it is, demand response. Some of it is your Google Photos album, not updating in the same millisecond that you upload the picture, but maybe 6 milliseconds or maybe 2 seconds. Or 6 seconds, God forbid, later, in order to match the cloud cover of the solar panels. Right? If you want to ensure carbon-free electricity and there is intermittency, okay, fine, your photos don't update immediately, they update a few seconds later. And you basically match your demand for energy as a high-tech company with lots of demand with the availability of the carbon-free energy source. That's part of it. A big part is, yes, it's massive quantities of renewables. Yes, it's nuclear. Yes, it's investment in geothermal. I'm not going to mention fusion now, but okay, fine, yes. At some point, eventually, right? Not a climate tech, right? An R&D tech. Sure, let's do that too. Speaking of high tech, right? But a lot of this, of course, is investing in the sort of energy sources that, yes, you are going to do because you have set yourself a target. Because you have said, okay, yeah, we are printing money left and right here. Let's figure out how to use that to, as a company, subsidize the sort of technologies up front, climb the learning curve, slide down the cost curve, because we can. And yeah, we know that these are how the trends are going, so why not put the CapEx down early? Yep, be part of the good guys, sure, but more importantly because, okay, if money is cheap to invest because it's your own, why not make that the focus of your investments? And I realize that's asking for a lot. It is. The demand response is cheap, right? That actually saves you money. The investment is, yeah, there is a sizable team in the employ of Google who does not know how their search algorithm works, whose sole focus is climate, energy. And, well, all the power to them. Quite literally, two senses of the term. The carbon-free power to them. Okay, we might have time for one more question.
So I want to ask the question from the more of a consumer perspective. As what, from a policy perspective, can states, can municipalities do to encourage consumers to convert to all electric, which is with the main disincentive now being that it's very expensive for an individual to do so?
Pass the right policies, pull the right policy levers at the highest level possible.
Yeah, sorry, I'm asking what policies would you recommend?
Okay, so usually for a municipality, it's basically buildings and it's transport, right? Okay, so for buildings, it's electrify, 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 insulate, 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 and yes, decarbonize the grid, and that might be outside the purview, right? What are the policies? Well, okay, for example, no new gas in new buildings.
So I'm gonna
challenge that. Okay. We do it 4 hours, so yeah,
no,
we can.
It's not. So I'll give you from my perspective personally, it's fine. I recently, I did some construction. I did it all electric. I had to increase my electrical capacity in my house.
Okay.
I installed solar, but in the process of getting the approvals from my lovely city of Palo Alto, California,
okay,
they decided they need another transformer, and they wanted to charge me $11,000 personally for it. I did not pay the $11,000. I won't get into that. The city paid for it, but that's the point of my question. I didn't have to convert anything. Okay. But I have neighbors who have older houses who they would have to convert, and it's costs thousands of dollars to do that. Even putting the transformers, I would argue the city should just invest in it, which is
fair enough, of course. Okay, so
fine. Those type of policy questions. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear.
Okay, so actually, I'm not going to go back to the Texas slide yet again, right? But one of the points for California is regulatory reform, right? I mean, in that case, I meant it for utility scale solar, but yes, right? Don't stand in the way of people trying to do the right thing. Now, there might be a good reason for them requiring your transformer. I don't know. There probably wasn't, right? Or put differently, there is some sort of blanket policy that may or may not have applied to you directly, and therefore. So let me end on this, which is my personal decarbonization story, if you will. 5 years ago, not that big an apartment, just to be clear, Manhattan, right? 750 square meters. We blew $100,000 to cut the gas line, and basically, right, heat pump and induction stove, insulate, insulate, insulate in a 200-year-old third floor walk-up. Okay, had we done this last year? it would have cost a third. In part, thanks to subsidies, Inflation Reduction Act. For the most part, our induction stove was $5,000. By now, IKEA sells an induction plate for 60 bucks. Now, okay, so we have like the Wi-Fi enabled one. I still don't know what Wi-Fi does on the induction stove, but we've got it. And yeah, you can still blow 5,000 bucks on your induction stove. But right, it used to be that the cheapest contractor grade way to boil your water, that's any one of us ever does in our kitchens in this city anyways, was a $300 gas stove. Now it is a $60 IKEA induction plate, which yes, uses the same technology as the $5,000 version. So in other words, of course, right, it takes policy. Of course it takes lots of other things, and who pays is basically the biggest question in all of this, of course, right? Who should pay? But back to the technology, it's pushing in one and only one direction. And no, we're not gonna unlearn how to build induction stoves. We're not gonna unlearn how to install or build solar panels. We're not gonna unlearn any of this stuff. So yes, oil, coal, and gas are commodities. Their prices will always fluctuate. Solar, batteries, induction, heat pumps, electric vehicles are technologies which can only get cheaper and better over time. Thank you.